I loved my education. I thought it was wonderful, and I am so grateful for all of it because our world is so crazy right now, and I love having all the tools in my toolbox, especially the intellectual ones, to navigate it. Because if you don't have that, it's murky and messy.
Welcome to the Ron Huntley Leadership Podcast, helping leaders be a positive catalyst on the people they support, the organizations they serve, and the communities they live in. This podcast will make you think, laugh, and grit your teeth with new determination to make your parish or business a place of transformation, passion, and purpose. If you're still breathing, you are powered for impact.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Ron Huntley Leadership Podcast. I am so excited to have Father Michael Rubeling with me today, who's an associate pastor. We're going to dive into the life, the mind, the thinking, the journey of an associate pastor through the eyes of Father Michael. Father Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ron. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. One of the things that we're hoping to accomplish as we do what we're doing today is to, perhaps give pastors some insight into some of the thoughts and issues that associates are coming to the table with and working through and sometimes wrestling with, and maybe for associates some insight into, maybe you'll hear some echoes of Father Michael's story in your own experience, which is always kind of interesting. And then for lay people, our hope is that you too will gain some insights into this season, this opportunity in associates' life to understand how you can support both prayerfully and temporally and really come around and also challenge these associates so that they continue to grow and feel supported in this season of their life. And then we're really excited to announce something cool that's happening for associates in October, associate roundtable that we're going to be launching. And so we'll tell you more about that as we get to that. So maybe, Father Michael, I'd like to start by asking you, when it comes to your seminary formation, what did you come away with? What were you armed with as you were ready to tackle the world as a newly ordained priest? Give me some insight into that.
So I was educated and formed over in Rome at the North American College, just to give you some insight into that. And I would say I came out with a very intense focus on the intellectual life. Just a lot of studies. I took 5 years. I got a license in theology, so very hyper focused on the intellect. But also the seminary gave me a lot of insight into a spiritual life, and for example, the Ignatian exercises or those kind of things. A desire. So I would say I was equipped to be a teacher. I was equipped to run retreats, let's say, or to think about that. And I would also say just a general, and this is, I say general, understanding of how to do the sacramental life. And I think as an associate, what I brought in was, okay, you know how to celebrate Mass validly, reverently, devoutly. You know how to hear confessions, but you still don't know necessarily what that's going to look like in practice. Mm-hmm. So that, I would say, is kind of what I brought in. But one thing I noticed when I entered into the parish, and I'm now 6 years in as an associate, is that it's almost the knowledge I like to use is like a hand, and there's multiple levels to the human being, and the intellectual finger, the spiritual finger grew way faster than the others. Right. So I realized that I needed there to be emotional maturity to take place, relational maturity, a grounding in self-awareness and a certain human formation. I got those things, but I think a seminary gave me such a hyper focus on the intellectual and the spiritual life that I needed a lot of work in my early days. I still do, on kind of other aspects of my life as a man, as a Christian, and as a priest. So that's what I think what the seminary gave me kind of coming out.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting insight. And that's not to downplay the value and the importance and the quality of that intellectual and spiritual formation, getting you ready for the sacraments, all necessary.
Absolutely.
One of the things I love in the work that I did with Alpha and is I worked with a lot of people who worked for Alpha who were ordained pastors in other traditions, and they envied the training, the theological formation and training of Roman Catholic priests. They just like were in awe of and envious of formation that takes place within the Roman Catholic Church. And so that's, again, not to downplay any of that, like totally awesome. And yet just some recognition and acknowledgement on your part that not quite as robust in areas that are probably needed in terms of being an effective and fruitful priest in a parish. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I want to agree totally with you that I loved my education. I thought it was wonderful, and I am so grateful for all of it, because our world is so crazy right now, and I love having all the tools in my toolbox, especially the intellectual ones, to navigate it. Because if you don't have that, it's murky and messy. But it's interesting you brought up Alpha, because when I got to my first assignment, they were running Alpha. And I would credit Alpha for a lot of the early transformation for me, where I remember I went through Alpha as a participant. I wore lay clothes. And I just was there, and it was wonderful. And I remember having to just, in response to the leaders kind of guiding me and through it, someone's going to say something that's, let's say, heretical. They're going to say something outlandish. And you just let them talk. You don't need to step in and correct them. This is not a theology lesson. Just be there with them in the experience. And it's through questions, it's through dialogue and conversation and connection that a change will happen. So it was a wonderful lesson for me in using kind of those intellectual gifts, but also being given new tools in a new environment to help me to change and grow and learn. And so Alpha was just an amazing tool for me. And I love just going through it as a participant and then coming back the next year as a helper, and then the next year as a leader. It was awesome. It was really awesome.
Isn't that neat? That it's fun to hear you say that. I was just processing it in real time as you're sharing that with me. And to leave the academic world, which is what you are trained in terms of theology in the seminary, and then to not disengage from that. It's like, no, take that intellect, that training, everything else, and put it in another setting, in a different context. And then for you to move from that teacher mode, which is the hardest thing in the world for so many people with Alphas, to not correct and allow conversation to happen, even if they're heretical. And I think that's what drives some lifelong Catholics crazy about the Alpha experience, is they're not comfortable with people having opinions and perspectives and experiences that aren't consistent with straight down the middle truth and teaching. But Alpha is that journey of being able to share an experience without being corrected or judged. And so that's neat that you were able to experience it that way,
Yeah.
And that's an interesting insight. Yeah, thank you for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking, what a neat way to maybe make practical, coming out of the seminary with all of that academic learning environment, where you are being graded and everything else on your marks, on your presentations, on all that stuff, and then applying it in a setting where actually you're making new disciples. And being in the midst of that messiness of thinking and the lack of formation and the lack of understanding, and be comfortable with that, knowing that that's a process first built on relationships and then slowly formed over time into people who, their conscience are properly formed by the teachings of the church. I love it.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So cool.
From that, it was just beautiful just to get into, or sort of to begin to understand as a young priest, what making new disciples is all about. And I really didn't even know that until getting into Alpha. It was not something we were taught in the seminary necessarily. They may hint at it, but to be on the ground, watching people go from a almost antagonistic searcher mode into, I want to offer my life to Jesus and come into the Catholic Church. And to see, like, I didn't need to correct everything and guide everything. I just let the Holy Spirit do his work. And I was able to step in sometimes with my intellectual gifts, but mostly it was the relational side that was the hook. And to watch that process has really changed my life.
Wow. And what's that look like too? Like coming from an environment where everybody else is also studying to be a priest, to now collaborating with a bunch of lay people. What was that process like for you? Because you mentioned you came as a guest, and then you were a helper, and then you were a co-host or a host. And so what was that process like for you, being surrounded by other clergy the entire time, or people striving to be a clergy, to being the clergy surrounded by lay people? What was that like for you in terms of the team and things?
I loved it. It was great. I loved the team that I worked with. They were great. And I realized very quickly, because of watching as just a guest, that I didn't have all the answers. That one of the clear insights I still have about coming out of the seminary is, I had 9 years of education, something like that,
Wow.
in the seminary. So a long time.
Yeah.
But the learning curve did not stop.
Right.
And so I looked at these lay people as they were still my teacher. They were my teachers, and I had to learn from them, but I was learning different things. And I found them to be super welcoming to me, and they wanted to collaborate. They wanted my insight and my leadership, but it's in certain areas. And they knew that they were guiding me in how to make disciples, how to do this alpha process. And so that was a great joy to enter into. And I found that I could provide for them a lot of, like, they knew the principles of alpha and this kind of guidance to a conversion moment.
Yes.
And I could step in with my intellectual gifts and be able to clarify for people via the teachings of the church and scriptures, like, this is what alpha is all about. This is what the foundation is. So they were delight to work with. I loved it. I loved every moment of it.
Wow. That's a neat, again, in our pre-conversation, this didn't come out. We weren't thinking along these lines, but
Yeah.
it's just kind of neat how that unfolded. It's like, wow, that's really cool. I've never thought about it like that. And so coming out of the seminary, what was your perspective? Well, very well educated, but what did you think you were bringing to the parish when you came out, or what had you hoped to? Like, what was I remember, let me back up a little bit. I remember being trained in the pharmaceutical industry. I studied so much on anatomy, chemistry, pharmaceutical, pharmacological, the competitors, all the different systems of the body, all the different language. It was a lot to learn, to study, to take the tests. And then when I got out, then I went straight into training for the company I worked for, and very specific in disease states and competitors within that, very clear on what your product did and didn't do. And it was an incredible amount of study. And then I went into, you're unleashed on your poor doctors with all this fresh information. I just thought, boy, I can't wait. And oftentimes you would know more than a lot of the doctors because you focus on one area. They're so knowledgeable in so many things. You're knowledgeable in a tiny little area. And so I would come across early with this zeal for the truth of what I knew and what I could bring and how I could form their thinking and how that would impact their patient care and outcomes. And there was a disconnect between what I thought they wanted to know and hear and what I felt I was bringing to the table. And it took me a while, which is normal looking back for new people coming out of training, to be almost there's what you're taught, and then there's reality, and there's what's in the middle is how you're going to be effective, if that's fair. And so there was almost a process of learning by your mistakes, and my zeal really not being well received at different times. And so that's what a lot of pharmaceutical reps are coming out of training with. And then there's this season, usually about a year anyway, before they actually become useful. No disrespect to any pharmaceutical salespeople listening right now, but that seems to be the evolution of pharmaceutical salespeople out of training. Yeah. And so what was that like? So if that gives us some framework and perspective for this question, what was that like? What's that experience like for you?
The whole idea of zeal is something I can relate to. I have a ball of energy, very zealous for the Lord. And a part of it is the intellectual life. That's definitely what I thought that I was bringing in. And I thought that I was bringing in kind of liturgical reverence and clarity and those kind of skills and abilities and knowledge. And this is something that I, as you're talking about, being the new pharmaceutical rep as a young priest, I recognize only later how much pride I brought into the ministry, especially when it comes to my pastor, because lay people are like, they just eat it up. Like, you bring in this young perspective, this young man he has lots of knowledge, and he's super passionate about the faith, and he celebrates liturgy very, like, he's trying to be very detail oriented about stuff. And generally the people love their priests. But I found that it was with my pastor that I brought in a lot of pride, and I didn't even know that it was there. It was this attitude saying, I know how to do things right. I'm going to change this. Here are my ideas. I've been thinking about this all my years of seminary. I'm coming in wanting to offer, and not really respecting the experience and knowledge of my pastor. And I'll say it's not an extreme thing. Like, I did have things to offer. And I did have stuff that was valuable to the parish, but it wasn't everything. And I realized there was so much, I was on kind of blinders of how much pride and arrogance I was bringing in into my time as a priest.
Wow. That probably takes a combination of humility and hindsight, and probably a dose of suffering. Is that fair?
That is fair. That is fair. Yeah.
Those are some of the best lessons are often, the best lessons are learned the hard way. And I'm mindful too of the pastors out there who have had associates, and maybe there's some pastors in dioceses who seem to get associates regularly, and they probably recognize these patterns and that process within a new graduate, a newly ordained priest. And I'm sure some have gotten better at communicating and being intentional and than others. I'm sure for some that must be challenging and hard and difficult, where for others maybe they've found a way to do that well. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I've got a couple, three pastors, and each one handled me a little differently. And I think all have their patterns of, decades worth of ministry, and they want the associate, they want the help of the associate. There's a desire there for some kind of relationship, but there is often, I find, a confusion in like knowing how to handle us I say us because like I've seen it also in my other brothers.
Right.
Like I have all this zeal, but sometimes it can be like, please put the zeal in this box.
Right.
Do it
Keep it away
here.
from me.
Keep it away from me. Others want to just let it like blossom out, and it just depends. It depends. And I found that one of my pastors in particular he was really struggling, and I appreciate it now looking back. He realized even more than I did that there was a generational gap, that like we as associates are trained a certain way. The seminary formation has kind of those things I was describing of the intellectual life and the spiritual life, Ignatian exercises, whatever, a certain idealism, a certain passion and zeal. And his generation of priests were trained differently. It was still 4 years of theology with some philosophy before that, but perhaps the liturgy wasn't as precise, or perhaps the certain emphasis on theology wasn't the same. And so trying to bridge those two worlds was very hard. And I could tell there was this struggle in him, again, looking back, because I didn't see it fully, of like, how do we make this relationship work? And yet, again, looking back, there were some things that he wasn't even aware of, even in being aware that there was a generational gap, that we're just not seeing eye to eye. And we didn't have as many conversations perhaps as we needed to be able to clarify, like, here is where I'm coming from, and Father, where are you coming from? And this back and forth. And so I would say that there's different pastors approach associates differently. And there's usually some kind of generational difference, which is neither good nor bad necessarily. It's just reality. And I think one of the biggest things that helped me was communication, was honest, vulnerable communication. Like, where are you? What are you doing? Let's talk.
And having that honest conversation where we can both be vulnerable can be tricky sometimes, because it does take two to tango. I remember just this summer I was at a friend's house, and I often have porridge for breakfast, and so I grew up pouring the porridge into a pot, and my friend's like, "What are you doing?" Like, "What do you mean, what am I doing?" Like, "Why don't you make it in the microwave?" I'm like, "A microwave? They've only been out 30 years. Can you trust those?" Or 40. So, but I just didn't even know you could make porridge in the microwave. And so, but it was funny. It was just so small, so weird, so funny, so different, so insignificant in so many ways. But I think there can be a lot of those little examples. And to your point, it's not like there's one way to make porridge. Well, there's not one way to make a priest. Right. I'm guessing even if you go to a different seminaries, probably seminaries have different feels to them. And so, for those lay people that are listening, it's like, yeah, there are a lot of variables. That's one of the beautiful things about the Catholic Church, I think. But it's but then put that into the context of the training of the other pastor, not to mention the age difference, and then the cultural differences in terms of this generational gap. You're also talking about the formational subtleties that can cause issues, and there is a power imbalance between an associate and a pastor, and I wonder if that's always appreciated and respected, in terms of those conversations, right? Because if somebody feels disrespected as a pastor, that's probably not going to go well from there.
Yeah.
Right. Pride and arrogance can do a lot of damage, and there is a power imbalance, and so that can rear its head in ways that probably cause hurt and pain. And again, that's not to say that always happens. It doesn't, but it can happen. It has to be navigated well.
Right. So you mentioned the word trust, and as you're talking, I'm kind of reflecting back on my experience, and I will say that coming out of the seminary, I'm idealistic. I have a lot of ideas, but I'm also sensitive. That's another thing I brought in. And I realized that one of my first pastors liked to tease a lot. And there was this visceral protection response from me.
Right.
Like, I don't want to share with you things that could be used against me. And this, like, again, kind of a generational gap, but also personality gap, which I didn't appreciate at first. That this other guy's coming at it like his way of affection is teasing and this banter that may even come into the, I don't think sometimes, if appropriately, into the public forum.
Right.
But for me, I was so sensitive that it was hard for me to be vulnerable. It's hard to enter those conversations of vulnerability because I was like, I don't really want this. And I don't know if other guys have had that experience, but I know that was mine, of this sensitivity that I had. On the one hand, I probably needed to grow a thicker skin, which I have over the years. But on the other, I remember after a couple of years of this, telling my pastor, like, I would appreciate it if there was some sensitivity in your part for dealing with me, and that back and forth. But I just remember that trust took a little bit while to build up.
Right. And wouldn't that be cool if, as pastors and associates, we could have those formative conversations earlier, so that it didn't take a couple of years of kind of distancing ourselves and protecting ourselves and finding ways of avoiding. So, right, like, how can we intentionally make the time to form well, so that when things do come up, and they always will, we can solve them quickly and get back to performing, versus harboring hurts and causing distances, kind of disengaging, hoping it will go away, avoiding the conversations, in which case it only grows and festers, which that's common in every sphere of life. In marital relationships, in business relationships, in the church and ministry, all of those become they're just part of being human. And so how can associates and pastors have really interesting conversations early to understand differences before problems arise? Because it's always easier to deal with problems before they arise, because after they arise, you realize how many assumptions you've made.
Yeah.
And then that conversation becomes difficult to have.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's
yeah.
So what are your thoughts looking back? And again, I really appreciate too your honesty and self-reflection in terms of how you came out, what you were working on, what formed you, what was difficult for you, some of the things you maybe had to wrestle with. But what are some things looking back that you would say you've grown in? Well, how have you grown as a priest, as a man, as a baptized Christian during these last 6 years as an associate?
Oh, in so many ways. I'd say a big one to go to that whole idea of vulnerability, that understanding there's a strength in vulnerability, and to grow in courage, to be able to speak my mind, to be able to enter in those conversations that are a little bit more difficult, and say difficult things, and also receive difficult news and criticism. And was so sensitive early on to any sort of criticism, especially from authority figures, to grow and like, no, this is for my good. This is for my building up. I would say I had to grow, and I have grown a lot in boundaries, and understanding that I need to as I come in as a young priest, I'm full of zeal and vigor, and I want to go save the world. And literally, that comes out of my mouth, just save the world, and realizing that I am not the savior, and I can't save everybody, and that I need to put up boundaries and say, you know what, like I can see a lot of problems in people's lives, and as a young priest, as a priest in general, you see just the issues of the world, and you kind of have to let those sit. And it was hard for me not to intervene, and learning to put that in God's hands to say, that's not my responsibility right now. I can do what I can do in safe and environments and organized structures, but just let things set. People need to work through their issues with the Lord, not with me necessarily. And that was hard for me to learn, but I have learned a lot from that. And the need that I tend to overwork. I'm so excited about working that I tend to overwork. And so I've learned the value of rest, of relaxation, of silence. And it's, I would say, distinguished too, like silence and reflection and prayer, because they overlap, but they're not the same thing.
Wow.
And to be able to have that time with the Lord where I just am intimate with him and we're just together every day, but also take time every day just to reflect, like, how am I doing? Am I so go that I don't actually take time to reflect on what's going on inside of me? What's my, how am I responding to my pastor? How am I responding to parishioners? Am I tired? Am I angry? Am I sad? I would be moving so much that I'm not even aware of what's going on. And that, so that, I would say one of the big insights is that kind of trickling from my need for rest and just to put the brakes on has led to a whole lot of insights in a lot of other areas.
Yes.
So that's that's a snapshot, maybe quick snapshot of kind of a lot of ways that I've grown over the years.
That sounds like a wonderful recipe for wisdom, really. To slow down, to reflect, to listen. That's so cool. I literally in my prayer this morning was saying the same thing. I'm noticing some sensitivities in myself in this last week and not handling things the way I would like to or normally do, or at least think I don't normally do. And just realizing in prayer, like there's something going on, and why am I the last to know? Like it's like I have a log in my eye. And
I heard someone
so
talk about that
really,
one time.
that should be in scripture somewhere.
Yeah.
And just recognizing, like, Lord, I need your help because something's off. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I know where to go, and that's you. And just praying more in the Holy Spirit and surrendering even deeper, knowing that there's a mystery going on in me and I'm not quite sure where it is. Sometimes you're wondering, is it a spiritual attack? Is this because I'm not getting enough rest and working too hard? Like what's at work here? But just that sensitivity that comes from self-awareness, and but if that's not followed up by the silence and the listening as well as the prayer, then I can just bury it and just grind it out. And that's dangerous. That puts me in a spiritually dangerous place. Yeah.
I was talking with on that note, I was talking with a priest friend of mine recently, and we were commenting on our early years of priesthood, and that one of the things that we, again, came in with was the overwork is a desire for affirmation and identity. That both of us weren't settled in just being. Our identity, our goodness needed to be achieved. I'm using my words precisely, needed to be achieved through doing. So, let me run this ministry. Let me do this awesome homily. Let me, and please praise me. Please tell me that I'm good. Instead of that, like, I can be good in stillness. I can be good in making mistakes. I can be good in weakness. Like, man, that took a long time. I'm still learning it. I don't know if I'll ever fully get out of that, but man, it took a long time.
That's so beautiful. Identity really is the seat of sustainable fruitfulness. What is our identity? In fact, maybe I'll just pivot for a second, because one of the things I'm in the process of doing is putting together a course for dioceses that are interested to but there are newly ordained priests or people that are still associates through. And I'm going to look at 5 things through this course. Identity is the first one. Who do you think you are? What's it mean? What's it mean to be a priest to you? Like, who do you think you are? What do you think that means? And so spend some time on that. And the next thing we'll look at is, how have you been hardwired? Like, what are your strengths? What are your superpowers? Do you know what they are? Can you articulate them? And what are those things at the bottom that you're not good at, that you're probably never going to be good at? And then the third one is, take a look at your charisms. What are your ministry charisms? Where are you naturally hardwired to focus, where you'll get your energy and have your impact? And then to take a look at owning this season of your growth as an associate, like really setting goals for yourself, even if you're in a tricky posting. Like, I mean, this season, this posting that you're at now might be a difficult one. That's okay. It doesn't mean you can't learn. And sometimes I've seen associates kind of check out, play safe, and just try to keep their head down and stay out of their way, and miss this season to be more intentional about growth, even though it's difficult. Now, thankfully, that's not everybody's experience. A lot of people have great experiences, and that's awesome. And yet there are times when it's not so simple, and to take ownership of that. And then finally, to refine, or even in some cases, I guess, hit the reset with you and your pastor, so that you can make the most of the rest of that assignment. And so those are the 5 courses the course and the 5 topics that I'm in the process of putting together for diocese to put their young priests through. And then I want to invite everybody to join us for an associate priest roundtable. We're going to have it once a month, the 3rd Wednesday of every month. It's going to be Atlantic Standard Time. That's my time here on the Atlantic Ocean in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I believe it's at between 5 and 6. But if you go out to ronhuntley.com, you'll be able to sign up for that. Once go to events, and you'll be able to sign up for that. It is only for associate priests. It's not for associate priests and their pastor. It's not for associate priests who've just been made administrators. It's not for seminarians. It's only for associate priests. And so if you're an associate priest and you'd like to join us for that roundtable, I'm going to talk into a particular theme for a very short period of time. We're going to break people up into small groups, and we're going to come back, talk about it, spend some time in questions and answers. And we're really hoping that this will be an opportunity to speak into some of the things that you're excited about, some of the things that you might be struggling with, to help equip you to be amazing when you get to that big chair, when you sit in the big seat. Because the truth is, so many of us think that when we get to that next level of influence and impact, we're going to do a better job. And I'm sure you will. And I hope you have that disposition and attitude. However, if you check out during this season of learning and play it safe, it's going to take you another 10 years after you're in that seat, if you're lucky, to be as impactful and fruitful as you think you're going to be, because it's always harder than you think it is. And so if I can help with my experience of coaching for the number of years I've been coaching in different parts, if I can help you be intentional and wrestle with issues so that you can make the most of this season, and we can do this together in a conversation, no charge for it, just come and experience it. But anyway, if that's going to be helpful to people, Michael, do you think that's going to be going to fit the bill? Do you think that will be worth associates attending and checking out?
Absolutely. I think as you were talking about the whole thing and reflecting on it, just a simple fact to be able to gather together as fellow associates, to be heard and seen, to know that our triumphs and our challenges are shared. That in of itself is huge. And to be given insights and have the intentionality to work on things and to be lifted up and encouraged. And I think that it's enormous. And looking back, I wish I had that. Really. I wish I could have had a place to go where I could have shared and been vulnerable, and then not to stay in that negative place, and to come out and to be affirmed in my gifts and my strengths and say, like, no, the Holy Spirit's doing stuff. Let's go. So I think it's going to be great.
Well, that's awesome. Well, as a leadership coach in the Catholic Church, I can never let people stay there too long. I'm a bit of a butt kicker, and so it'll be really fun to listen and to learn and to grow in friendships with each other. I can't wait for that, and I will always be calling folks to find that next gear of impact, because I just find being a priest is the coolest vocation ever. And so if I can help you guys be amazing, I think my call in life is to make people great. And I think the best way to make people great is to bless the daylights out of priests so that parishes can be unbelievably fruitful, because
Mm,
Jesus came to make us great. I
Amen.
came that you might have life and have it to the full. And I think the local parish is anybody's best chance. It should be everybody's best chance to live a life worth living. And so when we work together to not lose that hope, to not lose that vision of what's possible if churches are really, really healthy and fruitful, then man, we can impact a pile of lives. And that's where I think your vocation as a priest is so exciting. Like, it really is amazing that you get to bring Jesus to people and bring out the best in them. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
And thank you, Ron, for encouraging us as associates and offering this opportunity, because to have a coach, to have somebody behind us, and just priests in general, but especially pastors and associates, it's just a great gift. So thank you. Appreciate it very
Oh,
much.
you're welcome. It truly is my pleasure, and I'm excited about it. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I enjoyed this conversation a ton. Thank you, Father Michael,
Thank you.
for your generosity of spirit. And thank you for listening. Please, if you're watching on YouTube, hit that thumbs up button. That would be much appreciated. Please think about subscribing, sharing it with your friends, commenting, asking questions. And if you are an associate priest, I'd invite you to go to ronhuntley.com and sign up under events and join us for a roundtable. Check it out. See if it's something that's going to be a blessing to you. Invite your associate priest, classmate, friends. And if you're a bishop or somebody working in the diocese and you're thinking, holy smokes, this would be a really excellent tool for us, then why don't you reach out, just hit the connect button, and we'll have a conversation to see if that course that I'm going to put together might make sense for your diocese to bring more support for your newly ordained priests. That would be wonderful. God bless you all, and thank you for listening.
I want to encourage you, as you lead this week, be faithful to God and generous to others. See you next time, and remember, if you're still breathing, you